right, welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. Of course, in case you're just joining us, we are talking about just dissecting the big conversation that has been happening in Dubai at COP28, sieving all the information that is coming in and getting what is really necessary for us, and how do we move forward with that particular information. And I just want us to finalize on what we were talking about earlier. And with this, I'd like us to listen to our very own Head of State, President William Ruto. He has been part and parcel of this particular global conversation, talking about the global carbon tax push. And of course, we just want to listen into his view on this particular subject and his concerns. This is what he had to say concerning the issue of carbon tax.
The whole space around carbon pricing, carbon credit, carbon market is a new field. What we insisted in the Nairobi Declaration of African Leaders is that we must have integrity around that space. We must have integrity around carbon pricing. We must have integrity about carbon markets and about carbon trading. And that is the reason why we are changing regulations. We are changing policy. We are providing incentives for investment in this new field. And what we are saying, and why I'm confident, is that slowly the World Bank has taken up this challenge. And now we're going to have a uniform carbon price for carbon trading. Once we have integrity around carbon pricing and carbon markets and carbon trading, we will use the price of carbon to raise resources for our own development and for funding development needs of countries that have these huge resources, amongst them Kenya and other African countries.
All right, that is President William Ruto, of course, speaking at an interview by CNN, and that is actually courtesy of that. Just getting his thoughts on this whole issue of carbon pricing and carbon tax. And he has said it himself that this is still a very new domain. Do you have the same sense, Dr. Rono?
Yes, I think.
Do we really understand when we are talking about carbon tax, carbon credit? Have we gotten to that space as Kenya? Let me be specific, to really understand what this means for us and what it is, even to start with.
I think if we were to put it in context, relative to other countries, especially countries in Europe, I think this is a fairly new concept that we have. And even in our domestic space, before we talk about carbon tax, the concept of tax in itself is not very well mainstreamed in Kenya. I think the tax has been very heavy on the formal sector, which is about 20% of the economy. The other 80% is not within the tax ecosystem. So you more or less need to tell people about the tax concept and then move on to talk about carbon tax. And I think before we can talk about carbon tax, I think we need to think about maybe much more simpler metric that people could use. I think in some European countries, people, sell they have solar panel installations in their houses, and they sell power to the country or to their national grid and get paid for it and get some rebates. So that concept is a bit closer home. I think in our context, I mean, if you talk to the ordinary citizen on the street, I think the concept of carbon tax is a bit far removed from reality. So I agree with the president that this is a new space, and how do you actualize it in real terms? I think it's at an institutional level, financing institutions are probably closer to that concept, and they can understand it and negotiate or support government to negotiate for carbon credits and carbon tax. But I think to the ordinary citizen, I think that is a bit far removed, and I think there's need of a lot more engagement at country level to get people to appreciate what that means to small businesses, to individuals, and then onwards to the country.
All right, and let's talk money, and that's where you come in, Margaret. Let's bring this message home. Yeah, yes. I mean, they say that it's the new oil. What are the dynamics?
Yes. Okay, thank you. So again, maybe some background context to the carbon credit. So it was in 1997, I believe, at another conference of parties meeting, where party delegates agreed to put a price to carbon. They said, if you have a carbon unit that is emitted, this is the price, and you should find a way to abate or avoid that emission. Now that led to what is known as a Kyoto Protocol, upon which the carbon credit has grown since 1997. But in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was being discussed, it was agreed, exactly as everyone has mentioned just now, the carbon credit didn't really work very well for Africa. For example, in Kenya, I believe KenGen and maybe a few other private entities were the only ones who were able to tap into that market, because you needed to operate at scale. And you needed to be a large entity, you needed to pay for verification and accreditation for that credit to count so that you could get the money. So in 2015, when discussing the Paris Agreement, it was agreed to have market and non-market mechanisms. So market mechanisms are the carbon credits, but you also have non-market mechanisms that now allow for each country's context to be recognized. Now, I will admit that that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement has not yet fully been worked on. But for us at the African Development Bank, one of the steps we've taken towards the non-market mechanisms, how we could make this work for African countries, is developing an adaptation benefits mechanism. So give the example of what Engineer was talking about, the irrigation system for the smallholder farmer. So if you have the farmer putting in the irrigation system, and let's say they have the benefit of having a solar system, they're supplied with a solar system, then they may not be interested in getting the carbon credit. But for them, the benefit is that now the money that they would spend on buying fuel, they don't have to spend it, because they're getting electricity from a solar panel, and they're able to run their irrigation system anytime in the year. But perhaps they may be interested in something that's more relevant, and that's now where you have benefit sharing mechanisms coming into play. So the smallholder farmers could perhaps form a group, and they then say, okay, we're going to adopt this technology of solar irrigation. We're also going to adopt, together with that, we're going to plant in different ways. We're going to undertake climate smart agriculture. And through that, they're then able to, for example, get a better price for their crop, or they are then able to get access to inputs, or they're able to get access to insurance. And those are now the benefits that start to come through from adoption of these technologies. So I would say that the focus on the carbon credit it's warranted, and it's a discussion that will continue, because the carbon credits are still there, they have not gone away. But to touch on what President Ruto also talked about, so the carbon tax is seen as, so in developed nations, the carbon tax is seen as more of an incentive. It's an incentive to do business in a better way. So for example, you'd have, in Europe, you have cars that are not electric vehicles are taxed at a higher rate than electric vehicles. And that is to drive adoption of electric vehicles. So what does that tax then do? That tax goes into financing the development agenda. For example, you have in Europe, they'll take some of that carbon tax that they charge, and they use it to drive the electric mobility program in Africa or other initiatives. So carbon taxes should be seen as sources of revenue. And it's actually interesting that in the National Treasury's medium-term expenditure framework, they are considering other alternative sources of revenue, including debt for nature swaps, debt for climate swaps, and carbon taxes as forms of revenue, but also forms of incentives to drive action. So let us have that discussion in that regard. Is this an incentive for business to do better? How can we make it? How can we make business adopt these new technologies so that they can help drive this agenda of carbon taxes or carbon credits?
Fostering a cleaner Africa. I'd like you to weigh in. No wonder they say it's the new oil, just from your explanation. Engineer, I know you have something to add, but I like the fact that we are actually even having this conversation. It may be a new phenomenon that we are getting into, but just even talking about it and breaking it down and finding linkages on how this relates to that person who is at the very corner of this particular country, for me, that's pivotal.
Safin, when you talk of an oil, in the context of the new carbon credits, it means money.
Yes.
And Safin, when you talk of money to Africans, you know how business it goes. It is not money that actually is going to trickle down to people who are affected by the drought and climate change, but it is money and oil that is going to the pockets of who and who. That is why African countries are very much interested with this issue of climate finance. To me, we should really look at where did we come from? What happened? What transpired? Why we are here talking about the theme of temperature rise. That is it. So the African states, even the international government, should ask themselves, we are here experiencing the climate change, weather changes. What made us to be here today?
So shifting the conversation.
So we are shifting the conversation from the reality to money, where the money we are really looking for in terms of billions, a very small percentage will really trickle down to Mama Mboga's really affected there. When you talk of carbon tax, well, I mean the developing countries, or we can talk of the developed countries like China. They are manufacturing using thermal plants, so they are generating quite a huge amount of carbon. So what is happening with the carbon tax regulation is that as you continue to generate carbon emissions, then you will be taxed. You are being taxed so that you find alternative ways of generating energy using green resources. But look at this. Today, China is actually generating solar, we can say renewable, almost 300 gigawatts. That is China. But we still accuse them of generating much more carbon emissions to the grid. Here in Kenya, we are only having 0.2 gigawatts, 0.2. And we are accusing China, which has 300 gigawatts, of not producing energy using renewable sources. So what are we saying? We are accusing those who have made steps, those who have made policies, those who have made adaptation real in ensuring that they go green. Even when you talk of the Europe, Germany, their cars, actually, they have really made tremendous attempts of going green energy in transport, mobility, and so forth. Come back to this country. Just 4 years ago or 5 years ago, we commissioned an SGR, which is actually using thermal fuel. When we knew, because 2017, 2017, we knew these things. And people, me personally, if you go to my Twitter, I said very well that we are in a world from 2010 that we cannot afford to have a country run by an SGR, which is thermal. Then after 5 years, today you see now the president is running up and down, asking for us to go green, when a project they did in the last 4 years, commissioned towards 2017, is actually one of the biggest generator of carbon emissions in the transport mobility.
All right,
then before that, in the African Climate Summit, we were in a room with the CS Mukomen, and he was talking about the e-mobility, which is very key. I wish we go e-mobility, but we need to ask our question in the back of our mind. Where are we getting power to run this e-mobility? Because those cars are heavy consumers. Actually, they are not the motors. The motors running those, the traction motors running those cars are very high consumers. Today, we have a problem, and we had a power outage. One day, I will come to explain as an electrical engineer what happened with that power outage.
We all want to know.
Oh, yeah, we all want to know. But the problem is, our power generation and our power consumption demand are almost the same. Sometimes the demand is high, and that is why we still run thermal plants. The Kipevu sometimes is running. Even in at the river here, we have thermal power plants. The reason being, our power generation sometimes is slightly than our power demand.
All right. I'll come to you, Dr. Rono, just also to weigh in on what he was saying.
Yeah. So maybe I want to step back and maybe focus the conversation a bit on the solutions. I feel like what the president is saying about carbon tax, boils down to the fiscal space. like whether it's a fiscal space for climate or fiscal space for health. And ultimately, that fiscal space is limited for any country, and for Kenya particularly, and many African countries, it's actually under a lot of stress. So the question is, how can we achieve all our obligations given that limited fiscal space? So the reality is, Africa bears, a disproportionately high burden of diseases, where like 13% of the global population lives here, but a quarter of the diseases are here. Access to electricity is not very stable. I think from our own analysis at TNK Consulting Firm, it's probably about 20 or 30%. And even that 20 or 30% is erratic. So I think then it brings a question of, we need to find a new way or an innovative way to meet our health targets, our climate targets, our food targets. And we had a summit at the Kenya Innovation Week last week where we convinced stakeholders around climate and health and innovation. And one of the things we were showcasing is business models where we are addressing several SDG targets at the same time. So one is, how do you get universal health access to facilities that don't have electricity? You probably can do off-grid solar solutions. How do you do that? Many investors find that space very risky. So we've tested out business models to say, how do we test out build, operate, transfer models or lease models that electrify health facilities using off-grid energy that is renewable, and then demonstrate that that business model works and attract private capital. That means you help the country address health needs without necessarily waiting for any significant investments on expanding the grid, which costs a lot of money and the fiscal space in the country doesn't afford it. So I think the innovative ways that help to close that gap in a way that eases the pressure on the fiscal space. My feeling is that the president and many other presidents of low, middle income countries are struggling with a constrained space where you're saying we still are not achieving our health targets on SDGs, we're still not achieving our climate targets. And I think it's time to think about what are the innovative ways to do it.
To do that.
And I think the work we've done to show that you can actually deploy business models that are commercially viable to power health facilities on like off-grid energy is a good example where you could use some guarantee funding to help developers de-risk the process, but you help a hospital, be able to access power that they didn't have before, increase their scope of work, increase their income. And I think to your question about the carbon tax conversation, I think if you look at businesses in Kenya, they will understand that language which talks about their P&L. How do I increase my revenue? How do I reduce my cost? I think that's a starting point. If I'm running a hospital in Kajiado and my revenue is now higher because I can do ultrasound, I have stable electricity, I can do immunization because I have a refrigerator, my revenue grows and my cost is going down. That's a good starting point. And then the next conversation is to say, okay, can we engage with the tax regime to say, can I get some rebates because I'm doing things better? What incentive can you give me? And I think, to me, breaking that down for your viewers, I think helps to close the conversation.
All right. Margaret, I wanted to do something for me, because something that is very clear even in this conversation, and conversations I've had before when we're talking about matters climate change, there's a very big voice that is growing that is telling us to shift from climate financing. Let's not talk about money. Let's talk about where the rain started beating us from. Yeah. But then again, we have on this other side another growing voice on climate financing and how developing countries are having complexities accessing these funds, the lack of integrity even that we had from our head of state. So where do we go? Play that role for me, neutralize this conversation.
Okay. That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I know I've really put you on the spot, but just do that for me.
I'll do my best. Let me pick up a little bit, just take a step back on this energy discussion, because as we know, energy is everything. It's quite crucial for in economic development and for livelihoods. And within the framework of climate action, so the discussion is around energy transition. So we realize that a number of countries are running on fossil fuels. They will continue to run on fossil fuels for some time, and that links with what engineer was saying. But what is required is to show a general path of transition. So, Kenya is we're quite blessed because we have huge resources of renewable energy. We've had hydro and geothermal as part of our baseload energy for quite a long time. So we're more on the renewable side. But we do have other countries that perhaps are not in that state. And then, and even as Kenya, to grow our renewable energy resources, now the discussion is around battery energy storage. So what we need is, if you have the windmill turning in the middle of the night, but people are not using that power at night, that energy could be stored in a battery and then released out during the day when the windmill is not turning. Or likewise with the solar panels, they could generate power during the day and store that energy and then use it at night through the energy storage. And it must be commended that African countries are now starting to take up this battery energy storage as quite a crucial part of their energy grids, because when you have the batteries, now you can roll out renewable energy. So, for example, the African Development Bank is part of a battery energy storage consortium that is working with countries towards a 5 gigawatt roadmap by 2030 to ensure that we can support African countries on this. And Kenya is actually a partner on that battery energy storage consortium. So I just thought it would be important to mention. And also with regards to de-risking investments in renewable energy, especially for the private sector. So we know very well that going into an area such as energy generation is fraught with so many risks. You don't know if you'll get the amount of energy that you put on your paper. You don't know whether there'll be issues perhaps to do with the transmission line risk, which has happened in Kenya. And again, within the African Development Bank, we have the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, which is actually working to reduce these market barriers. So we work with private sector and we help them de-risk their investments in a number of African countries. But let me come to your question about the money and where we are going to. So I think, in my view, for the case of Africa, we have not received enough climate finance yet for us to be able to say, okay, now we can move on to something else. No, we still need the finance. We still need the finance to be able to develop our renewable energy potential. We still need it to improve our agriculture systems. We still need it to improve our transport and infrastructure systems. That is crucial. So we cannot say that we move away from the debate on climate finance. We should continue to push for it. But on our side as well, we should also do our part. And I think that it is also commendable. So a cocktail of both. Yes, so it is commendable. From the Africa Climate Summit that was held in September, President Ruto hosted the meeting under the auspice of the Africa Union, and he was very clear that Africa, yes, is a victim, but we could also play our part in driving the solutions, in driving the action. And as a result of the Climate Summit, actually one of the key milestones that came out is the announcement of the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative, where a number of countries have signed up to say, we would like industrialization in our countries to grow our economies. We would like to take up renewable energy, but we need to do this as a partnership. So let us invite foreign entities or other countries to come and invest, to drive up or to ramp up industrialization in our countries. But we will also play our part. We'll make sure that we have the right laws. We'll make sure that we create an investment environment that is ripe for this industrialization to grow. All right, great. So I see it as a two-pronged approach that, yes, Africa should continue to ask for the climate finance and demand it, but we should also continue to play our part. The transition. Yes. All right, I want us to continue having this conversation on the green journey that we are taking, and I want to introduce something that our head of state also said. We are talking about a clean Africa, a green Africa, and a low-carbon economy, and that is where we all want to go. This is what the head of state had to say about this.
We have 60% of the world's renewable energy. We have 40% of the world's minerals necessary for energy transition. We have the largest tracts of land for smart agriculture. And we have the largest natural carbon sinks or nature sinks. So we are indeed the new kid in the block, the powerhouse around renewable energy.
you know, it's the new kid on the block that stood out for me. But Engineer, do you think we have what it takes to really go that direction? The head of state is really confident and affirms that, yeah?
Actually, we have what it takes.
Are we the new kid on the block?
We have what it takes. If tomorrow the president will tell his CS Chirchir to pass a bill called net metering, I think that is the backbone of what we call going green. Why? Let me explain. And I told, actually, President came to our backyard in Migori, and I had some few minutes to talk to Chirchir, in the side events there. And I told him, we've had a challenge in the implementation of the net metering bill. It has been there for very long. And I know the last admin really ensured that it is castrated because it was going to get some power guys out of the market. What happens with net metering is, and most countries have implemented it, if we want, the Kenyan power is around, the demand is around 1.9 or around 2 gigawatts at the moment, maybe around 2.3 at the highest. Today, when you go to the Seven Forks, even if it is raining today, I think last 2 weeks or a week ago, the Ministry of Energy went there and found the level of water was still low. Maybe sometimes later this month, it will overflow and we'll have some even more effects downstream. But next year, March, you will be told that there's no water in the Seven Forks. And what happens is that we'll have our base power at geothermal, then we'll have to resort back to thermal power plants. So net metering bill will ensure that you as Sefin, you are living here in Nairobi and you have a home back in Ushago, as well as me. I can decide to have solar or wind or anything in these Royal Media rooftops, so that if Royal Media Services is consuming 100 kilowatts at the moment, then I decide to install 120 kilowatts. Then in a day like this, I'm able to generate 70 kilowatts from solar. Then it therefore means that I'll be generating 70, then I'll get 30 kilowatts deficit from Kenya Power. But at the moment, sometimes you'll find, okay, for media you'll work throughout, but for a factory, there's a certain time that it will be down for maintenance. So there'll be no work, maybe for lightings and small power usages. So if a factory maybe has installed 200 kilowatts, then in a day that they are in maintenance, so there's no power that they're using, they'll be injecting 200 or 150 or so to the grid. Now the net metering bill will just monitor that in 30 days, you have injected how many kilowatt hours to the grid, and you received how many kilowatt hours from the grid. Now, it will be just like a barter trade. Definitely, you cannot be compensated for the exact number of kilowatt hours you've injected to the grid. But the net metering bill is looking at a way that if you have given 10,000 kilowatt hours, which are units, to the grid, how much money or how much unit should be compensated for? So if it is 70%, then 70% of 10,000 is 7,000 units that Kenya Power can compensate in the process. Right. So if we really have to get to the green industry, then the net metering bill, which has stayed for over 5 years, should be passed as soon as possible so that Kenyans are told to install solar as much as possible and then and then connect it to the grid so that when you are not using that solar at home, you are able to inject that solar. And the main advantage of that is that for me to get power at home in Migori, it has to be transported all the way from Kengen or Olkaria. There will be so much power loss until it reaches home. Right. But when I install solar at home, it therefore means if I have an excess, I'll just be transported to the neighbor who is just maybe 50 or 100 meters. So you now realize that you are going to have minimal losses on power transmission when people and locals are made to install solar in their rural homes.
All right, Dr. Rono, the same question. Why don't we seem to be making progress yet? Seems like we have what it takes.
Yeah.
You know, what is the problem?
I think I'll go back to trying to pick lessons from the past. I think climate is, like the president said, is more or less a new kid on the block, and it's a new phenomenon. But if you look at the other sectors we're in, I mean, let's talk about the minerals. He says, you know, we've got 40% of the minerals here, and your question is, how comes we have all these things and we don't seem to benefit? And I think for me, there are multiple levels. I think one of them is the question about the ultimate beneficiary. We have companies in Kenya and in Africa that, you know, mine nickel or copper, etc. But the question is, are those companies Kenyan? Are those companies African? So we could exploit the minerals, but then at the close of the financial year, we're repatriating profits elsewhere. And we see that in Kenya, where the forex shocks start hitting because huge companies are repatriating money outside of the country. So I think we've got the resources, but are we capturing the resources for the continent? I think, to be honest, I don't think we're doing that very well. And then the second piece is, I think, the global architecture of the financing mechanism. And I don't think that is even for Kenya or other countries in the region. And I think the president has spoken about that previously, where he's saying the global financing mechanism is not fair for the continent. And I'll give you an example, and this is not from climate, but from health. Prior to the focus on climate, there was the focus on COVID and the COVID pandemic and vaccine manufacturing. And the argument was, okay, look, we've got a huge population in Africa. Why don't we have our own vaccine self-sufficiency in the continent? We have countries like South Africa that make vaccines, and they are quite ahead of many others in terms of vaccine manufacturing, but they're not able to secure global contracts to supply the vaccines. And the question is, why did they miss out? It boils down to the global architecture on how the vaccines are procured, what are the requirements, is there any affirmative action towards low or middle-income countries? And I think we lost out on the vaccines on COVID in a big way, and I think the next wave is the climate one. And I think we lose out as well, because unless we are very intentional about how that global financing mechanism is structured, otherwise we'll end up with a situation where we adopt this, you know, carbon credit discussion, but are the units and the metrics equal and fair to countries that might be further behind than others? So I think for me, we are behind for those two primary reasons. The last point I would mention is that I think it's very difficult to negotiate as an individual country on a global scale. Your voice is maybe not just big enough. I think there's a need to coalesce, whether it's African countries or countries in the region, and speak as on a united front, because that voice...
Possible, though, because one of the concerns has been political alignments and, you know...
Yeah, but I think, if you look at it, if the European Union is speaking in one voice, you have the BRICS speaking on one voice, I think it's very difficult to then say Rwanda or Burundi is going to make an equivalent voice at the table. I think that concerted effort to have a unified voice makes the argument stronger. I think we need to do the analytics, have a very good metrics, but also what is the quantum of the advocacy that we are taking to the table? I feel like we need that, because if you look at the situation with the COVID situation, South Africa would advocate and say, look, we've got vaccines, we should get an equal footing on the table. But if that's the only lone voice in the continent, then no one listens to you. But if you come with the African Union and say, look, this is our conversation.
What I'm saying is we want to speak as one voice, but at the back room, we have our political alignments, we have our interests, we have our very own, bilateral relations with some of these countries that are pollutants. Can we actually speak in one voice as Africa?
I think we can and we should, and I dare say we must, because if you look at... Because if we don't, then what happens? If we don't, then we will continue with status quo, which is what the president is saying. We have a lot of resources. We're the new kids on the block. but how do you turn those resources into actual prosperity for the continent?
All right.
Yeah.
Margaret, I want to sample a few of the comments from our viewers, but before we do that, we want to go green. We have actually started that journey, though it's still snail-paced. A lot of challenges along the way. It's going to need money. It's going to need effort. It's going to need us to speak in one voice as Africa. Talk to us about how that is looking like in terms of investment. Do we have a plan? Do we have a strategy on how we want to go about this?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I agree that it is quite crucial that we speak as one voice as Africa, and I would say that we've made a bit of progress under the Africa Union, who brings the African countries together. We then have the Africa Group of Negotiators that agrees on a common position and attends these international meetings with a common agreed position for Africa to be able to negotiate as one. But there are other opportunities perhaps to also speak as one voice. We have the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. That's a growing area that we need to come together, eliminate the barriers for efficient trade in Africa and be able to grow economies. The other one is also quite related to energy access. Energy access is an enabler, and what has been realized is there is an importance to have electricity pools and also energy highways. So, for example, the bank is quite key on investing in, we have the East Africa Energy Pool, we also have the South Africa Power Pool, and to have an electricity highway that goes all the way from South Africa up to Egypt, because we realize that electricity is an enabler in all of these discussions that we're having. If we want to, for example, develop our minerals in a more better way and a more strategic way, we need to have the energy for it. It could be generated, for example, in Ethiopia, so why don't we interconnect Ethiopia to Kenya? Why don't we interconnect Uganda to South Sudan? Those are key enablers that we, again, used to, as African countries, have to come together, agree on, and then it helps set the right investment environment for climate action.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Let me just say something on this solution on green economy. For us to really attain what the President has said, this carbon financing should come with two things. One, it should ensure that we have local companies that are able to manufacture these green energy inputs, like either solar panels, windmills, in the country, so that we stop exporting everything. We have money, yes, money is going to come. But to me, I will really see a country that is able to produce its own windmills, solar panels, everything, so that we have a country that do not depend on China to import things when we have money and for climate financing. So let us not just speak of having money trickling down to go and pay people sitting down in conferences, but let us come up with mechanism to ensure that in the Vision 2030, when we have the carbon finance money coming into the country in terms of billions, then we are able to have companies that are able to employ Kenyans and are able to generate, to manufacture these kind of components.
Thank you, Engineer, for saying that. I just want us to sample some of the views you're receiving from our viewers before we climax this conversation. Remember, we invited your feedback. All right, we'll be sampling that as we continue with this particular conversation. A lot is being discussed here in terms of even the solutions that we need as Kenya, as Africa. And I know that you have a lot to say as well, as you have been following this particular conversation. And we will be reading some of your comments in just a bit. And as we, prepare to do that, we have, one... All right, we have Engineer Lazaro there. Engineer Lazaro is saying delegations to Emirates should be environmentalists only. All right, time to let experts display their technical knowledge in their field of professionalism, not joyriders jumping to every meeting just because of the allowances and small tokens. Engineer Lazaro. Okay. Sir Nixon Dungire, you say, as the waiting mode is on for the climate funding, it's worth noting that corruption in climate finance or misuse of the funds negatively impacts climate change intervention, undermining mitigation efforts to address the intended purpose. All right, we have Gabi Wakasiaka. Africa, and especially Kenyans, are key for forging consensus on the modalities of unlocking Africa's vast potential to positively impact the climate agenda and rally the world to tap the numerous opportunities that the continent presents towards global net zero ambition. We have Babu Michael K.E. As COP28 is coming to an end, resolutions, funding, promises made to countries like Kenya, I wonder if the current promises will be met, if even the previous ones haven't been. As President Suluhu said, we must look for homegrown mitigations. Powerful. J.M. Musoma, Kenya is busy pushing for carbon credit financing in Africa at COP28, yet the Climate Change Amendment Act of 2023 doesn't provide a legal framework for carbon trading. It's imperative that review of climate financing architecture first so that we can be taken seriously. J.M. Musoma. Daniel Sindani, 78. You say the concept of carbon credit is being fronted by the very countries that are biggest contributors to climate change. I have never trusted our former colonizers and their initiative to Africa. We need our solution to climate change as a continent. All right. All right, Gabi Wakasiaka, you say Earth is not only Africa. Earth, not only Africa, needs more than just conferences and speeches. It craves action and commitment. Let's stand up and advocate for climate change. It calls for each and everyone to take action. All right. I like the theme of this message is call to action and also a challenge for homegrown solutions, yeah? In as far as we are pushing for climate financing, what is it that we are doing back at home to be able to offer solutions to, you know, what we are going through? I want us to wind up this conversation and just give us sort of your way forward, your pressing action points that must be prioritized, that even as the delegations come from COP28, whether they were joyriders or experts, that's a conversation for another day. But as they come back home, what is it that we must start doing urgently as soon as today to be able to really progress? When we're having COP29, we are talking about a different agenda list and not the same issues that we have been discussing over time. I'll start with the engineer.
Yeah, so my expectation as the COP28 comes to an end is that, one, we need to have locally led initiatives. And just as I said, the first locally led, as an engineer in solar industry, we need to have companies that are able to manufacture locally led climate change, green components like either wind, solar, so that we depend on our own resources. It will be very sad, Safin, that in the next few years, with the money trickling in, we still import these products into the country. And the more we import them, we are just making that we have dollar crisis, because the more we import, we use dollar to really import these products. And solar, just as a key component, the trading in solar is going quite high. The importation of solar today is going quite high, and you need so much billions dollars for you to have solar components back in the country, batteries and so forth. Right. So the moment, if we really have a change in this, let us ensure that we have modalities to ensure that we set up companies and so that we start producing our own systems that will assist in aiding the climate change. All
right, you just reminded me there's a picture that we have that you wanted to weigh in your thoughts on. We'll be having it ready shortly. Okay. But let me just also get your thoughts, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. I believe as COP28 comes to an end and countries return, delegations return to the countries, I think this achievements, as I mentioned at the start, we should really commend the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, and we should start to hopefully see countries benefiting from that fund. The adaptation finance and an increase in this for countries that are most vulnerable is also a key achievement that I think we will see coming out of COP28. But to sum the conversation up, I think it wouldn't be good to finish this conversation without talking about the youth, what the opportunities are for the youth. Because remember, the youth are the ones who are seeing the impacts of climate change, these discussions, and wondering, do we even have a future? What does this mean if the world is going to end at a certain time? What does this mean for us? But it's important for the youth to know that there is a place for them in driving climate action. In fact, at the Africa Climate Summit, the Nairobi Declaration did include a youth declaration. The Youth Assembly came together and they did include their input. And within the African Development Bank, I'd also like to mention a program that we run known as the Youth Adaptation Solutions Challenge. So this is a challenge that identifies innovative businesses across Africa and has funded to date about 33 businesses, small to medium-sized enterprises that are run by youth, because we realize that youth have a role to play in driving the uptake of adaptation and the climate action for the future.
All right, thank you for saying that. Dr. Rono?
Thanks. So I think a couple of things. One is, I think, to acknowledge that the COP process is important. So I think it's important to close the call on that it's important. I think the question is, what do we do from here? I think we've got to bring the high-level declarations to like tangible outputs at the country level. I think in Kenya, I think we really need to figure out who does what. I think for government, I think they need to focus on creating an enabling environment that attracts investment into this space that can drive climate change innovation. And I think, for instance, if government provides a policy framework that enables developers of renewable energy, I think that alone is enough to drive in private capital to drive this ecosystem. Now, I think there's also a sense that we shouldn't expect that government is a silver bullet will fix everything. Mm-hmm. I think we also need to ask ourselves in the private sector, in the development space, what are we doing? I think in our work in the development space, I think our rallying call has been the development ecosystem and development partners have a bit of money that they can use to de-risk processes. And I think that would be a catalytic way to do it as opposed to funding operational items. So it could be saying, okay, let's de-risk the initial phases of testing out business models for green energy. And I think the last bit is, I'm a strong believer that the climate conversation is so connected to many things. And I think for us at ENK Consulting Firm, we do run a convening platform we're calling the ENK Connect. Previously it was called the HealthX, where we bring stakeholders from across different sectors. And I think that is important for us to do at country level, because it's very hard to say we'll move the needle on climate if we don't sort out food, we don't sort out the energy crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Jose Rono. Unfortunately, I'm really pressed for time for this conversation, but like we always say, when you're talking about climate change, we cannot completely discuss this subject. It's an ongoing conversation that we should definitely carry forward and normalize in our day-to-day conversations. I've been having this sit down with Engineer Victor Okuna, a renewable energy engineer. Thank you. We were also engaging Margaret Kamau, Principal Climate Change and Green Growth Officer at the Africa Development Bank. Thank you. And also this morning, we were hosting Dr. Jose Rono, Managing Partner, ENK Consulting Firm. Shukrani. And that is how we wind it up for the first part of our conversation. And we'll be taking it a notch higher. In just a bit, we are going to be talking about career mentorship in this long holiday season. We want you to understand the role that you play as a parent, as a caregiver, as a teacher, as a community in helping our young ones be placed in their career paths and to maximize their potential. Do stay for that and much more. For now, we take a short break.